So, in this lecture, I primarily want to talk about generosity and a related virtue Aristotle calls lavishness. And even though we've had quite a lot to say about generosity already as a virtue, there's a lot going on here, so there's still a fair amount left to say. So, anyway, Aristotle starts with saying generosity is a mean between what he calls ungenerosity, or your translation does, you might call it miserliness, stinginess, something like that, and extravagance. Now, Aristotle will say the virtue of generosity is closer to extravagance, closer to giving too much, closer to the excess. I think that's pretty plausible. I think most of us would agree. But one thing I want y'all to note is that there is a lot built into this virtue of generosity, a lot more than we might think. The generous person only gives to deserving causes. He or she will not help people when the help might be bad for them. And they won't help them or they won't help causes when there might be better things they could spend their money on, right? It involves a lot of judgment about what is or is not a good cause deserving your money and time. You know, the generous person would not give to, say, the addict who's going to use it in ways that might harm themselves. They might not even give it to somebody, your ne'er-do-well family member who has a get-rich-quick scheme and wants your money for his get-rich-quick scheme. The virtuous person probably would, the generous person wouldn't donate to that. The generous person won't give beyond his or her means, even to good causes, right? Virtue is supposed to be good for us, enable us to lead a good life, a worthwhile life, flourishing life. If you impoverish yourself trying to help others, Aristotle, contrary to the effective altruists and utilitarian sorts, would say that's not a good thing. The reason I say there's a lot built into generosity is the way Aristotle talks about it. It seems to be about making and spending money more generally. Now, one thing Aristotle will say, and I think he's right about this, is to lead a virtuous life, you need some means, right? You need some means, some opportunity to put your virtues into practice, and at least in our society, that might require some money, or will require some money. Virtuous person's not going to be obsessed with money, but they're also not just going to be entirely above it, because to even lead a life of virtuous activity, you will need some means. Fair enough, right? Note, courage. He talks about how courage ties in here. And I think interestingly, because anxieties people might have about money, it takes courage not to have that anxiety. It can take courage to be generous. So far, this all strikes me as fairly plausible. Where I think Aristotle gets into trouble is when he starts talking about this virtue of lavishness. Now, lavishness is really closely related to generosity. It might even be considered a special sort of generosity. Might put it in there, kind of a subheading. I don't know why Aristotle does this. If he's going to be concerned about lavishness at all, I think that's what he should do, but for some reason he doesn't. So what is lavishness? Some translations will talk about this as magnanimity, lavishness. These are all Greek words, so different translators choose different things. Lavishness is a virtue of giving on a grand scale. If you have the money to build a new wing of the hospital or endow a building at the university or, I don't know, something of that scale, that calls for lavishness. We might call it philanthropy, right? Now, this is a weird virtue in a few ways. For one thing, what does extravagance have? What does lavishness have that generosity lacks? I mean, I don't want to be dismissive of Aristotle. Great mind, whatever. But even great minds say some dumb things, and this it does seem like he says some dumb things here, right? What does lavishness have? Well, taste and classiness, right? That's just, I mean, what? Taste and classiness. It's very classy. But there's a deeper issue here, right? To have lavishness, to have this virtue at all, A, it's not clear why it's its own special virtue. But to have lavishness, to be able to practice this virtue, you have to be filthy rich. Well, now, as I've said, I think Aristotle is right to say, we need some means to be virtuous at all. But if you're going to be lavish, you have to be filthy rich, right? And remember, he likes to say that the virtues, you have to have them all to some degree to have any of them. Well, if you have to be filthy rich to be lavish, and you have to have all the virtues to have any of them, then it would seem, just by simple logic, you would have to be filthy rich to be virtuous. And Aristotle clearly does not want to say this, right? And it also just seems weird that, you have to know what is a tasteful, classy building to endow, or whatever. That just seems weird to build that into virtue. It seems like you're building a whole lot in here. So I don't think he wants to say we have to be filthy rich to be virtuous, but if we start talking about this virtue of lavishness, that's hard to avoid. I honestly just think he should drop this virtue of lavishness or extravagance as a virtue. Just get rid of it. It seems kind of dumb to me. I don't know. Maybe there's something to it, but to me, I think Aristotle would be a lot better off just cutting this part. If I had some suggestions, if I had a few notes for Aristotle, just select X for all the stuff on lavishness, right?